The year was 2122. Humanity had recently begun its first real phase of mass-scale bionic body augmentations. For the first time, it was now normal for people to swap out body parts with more robust, technologically integrated prosthetics for non-medical purposes. A man named Jack, age 29, had held off on all body modifications for as long as he could and was of the small remaining percentage of entirely organic adult human bodies. Jack worked one of the few still existing physical labor-based jobs, assisting in the construction, upkeep, and use of robotic machinery used to load and unload cargo shipping containers onto commercial ships that self-navigated themselves to and from delivery ports. While being one of the few remaining workers with biological arms and legs, Jack had inevitably fallen behind the increasingly high standards of the job. Naturally, his biological arms and legs grew tired and could exert only about 1/15 the force of the vast majority of his coworkers who had opted for the company-funded cyber-build brand mechanical prosthetic arms and legs. In order to stay afloat in the competitive automated job market, on June 3, 2124, Jack finally opted into giving up his biological arms and legs for bionic replacements. These bionic prosthetics operated by implanting various electrodes in areas of the brain that control movement and process touch sensation. The electrodes were then activated and engaged by the user's brain neurons as the user thought about and sensed movement, directing nerve signals back through the electrodes and into the bionic limbs, moving them essentially just like biological arms and legs. Following the procedure at the bionic surgery facility, Jack filled out all the necessary forms with his new hands. It was a bit tricky, but not too bad, he found. At the bottom of the form, he signed his name on the signature line, Jack Otis. Several years went by. It took Jack a little time to fully adapt and get used to the idea of his new arms and legs, but fairly quickly, he came to barely even notice them. Initially, he didn't recognize them when he looked down, but since he never really considered his arms and legs to be a crucial part of his sense of identity, it was relatively easy to eventually just assimilate them as a part of him. However, simultaneous to Jack getting fully accustomed to the new appendages, with technology and medical advancements seeming to only continue to multiply, much of the rest of humanity had begun taking on other newly developed, more extreme bionic augmentations in order to keep up with the increasingly competitive automated job market, as well as the heightening standards of living. Over the span of about 15 years, by age 45, Jack had exchanged out his ribcage, spine, eyes, ears, teeth, heart, several other organs, and eventually his skull and neck. The augmented replacements provided technological integrations that synchronized with external devices while also improving bodily strength, functionality, and longevity. These modifications were also intended to aid in slowing down the aging process and extending the universal average lifespan, which, with many of these initial bionic replacements, was predicted to easily extend in and past 200 or 300 years at least. At this point, Jack was essentially a human brain in a vat atop an almost entirely different mechanical body. The riskiest procedure, which also happened to be the last one Jack underwent, was the skull replacement that changed out his normal skull for a bionically integrated metal one, requiring his brain to be removed and then placed back into the new head, neck, and spinal configuration. Exteriorly, the skull looked like a completely normal human head with otherwise natural-looking skin and facial features, making the aesthetic transition fairly benign. However, each person who underwent the procedure was given the choice to change how their face looked to essentially anything they'd like, which Jack opted in for. Never having really liked his face all that much, he decided on a new one that looked completely different. Prior to and following the procedure, along with all the earlier procedures, Jack filled out and agreed to a variety of lengthy waiver and clearance forms, signing his name on each. Jack Otis. Within only a year of each procedure, sometimes just a few months, Jack mostly became used to his new augmented body parts. The face was of course the hardest and longest one to adapt to, but eventually, within the year or so, he started to recognize himself in it just the same as his old one. His face was never really him anyway, Jack felt. It was merely just the cover in front of him, and any arrangement or form of it could be him just as easily. At least once he got used to it. Ultimately, he lived contently with his new bionic body, feeling like no more than just a physically improved version of his original self. Several more years would go by. By this point, as a result of increasing artificial intelligence development, Jack had been automated out of his original job field, and the global socioeconomic system had shifted away from nearly all physical-based jobs. Consequently, after a harsh transition period, new industries, markets, and jobs started to take form across the internet landscape, especially related to things like VR, AR, art, communication, experiential services, software, and so on. Jack eventually landed a job as a set designer and coder for virtual reality entertainment performances. As a result of this shift, the long-anticipated mass-market consumer application of implantable brain-machine interfaces was approved during this time in the year 2146. The company Neuratai led the charge, beginning their first consumer market rollout with their Model BI brain-machine interface. Like all brain-machine interfaces, it worked by implanting tiny chips into the bionic or organic skull of the user. Tiny wires would then be connected from these chips and spread out into various essential parts of the brain. The wires could then receive and send messages from and through the user's neurons. As a result, the user could connect their brain to the cloud and via brain waves alone, operate devices and bionic technologies, communicate non-verbally with others online, as well as share and access public information, essentially merging thought with internet and wearable technology. One of the most notable features of the interface was that it allowed users to select and deselect technical skills and aptitudes that could be downloaded directly into the brain as if they had been learned or forgotten over a lifetime in just a matter of seconds. By activating patterns and sequences of nerve impulses, the technology rendered specific body movements and mental abilities that carried out various skills. Like all prior augmentations, the brain-machine interface was fully optional. Every step of the way, including this one was faced with the choice to either augment or not. However, inevitably, most if not all conceded eventually due to the apparent will to life that technology possessed and carried out through human socialization. For many years, recreational brain-machine interfaces confronted especially high resistance by groups that were against the general consumer adoption of the technology. For many prior decades, the technology had been exclusively approved and used for medical purposes only, strictly assisting with neurological disorders and body paralysis. Now, however, because of the need for enhanced mental capacities and digital integrations, the technology was approved and set to be used more or less to modify otherwise quote-unquote healthy human brains. Jack was one of the many who initially opposed it. It was one thing to relinquish parts or even the full body, but to go into the more abstract parts of the brain was something else entirely, Jack and others like him thought. However, just like all the prior augmentations, the technology exponentially creeped itself into the norm as more and more individuals adopted it, creating a greater sense of ostracization and exclusion towards those who did not. Like most things like it, it reached its inevitable tipping point and went from abnormal to have one to abnormal to not. Eventually, Jack underwent the simple and essentially painless procedure and awoke into a new technologically integrated brain. After going through a brief moment of recovery, he turned on the interface, viewing it through his bionically augmented eyes. He mentally filled in his name on the startup screen, Jack Oudis. It was weird at first, but mentally deciding to write versus mentally deciding to write and then watching your arm do it were fundamentally no different, Jack found, and he took to it almost right away. As time would pass and Jack became more and more used to his newly modified brain, he downloaded and relinquished certain skills and aptitudes and so on. After a certain point, to Jack's relief, it became clear that fundamentally, there wasn't anything really changing about him, at least no more or less than just learning new skills. Throughout Jack's biological life, he had obviously learned and forgotten many skills, ideas, capacities, and so on, but still always felt like the same person. And here too, despite the extreme rate, the same phenomenon seemed to occur. He realized he was never his technical skills or abilities, but rather the person experiencing them. As the modern world moved further into the digital mental realm, new brain-machine interface companies and models came out, aggressively competing with each other. Corporations started to more commonly generate and push software updates to consumers as an effort to keep their models at the forefront. Some of the software updates were relatively benign and were no more than bug fixes or additional skill set options or better integrations with bionic prosthetics. However, some software updates began to go further, dipping into desires, interests, habits, and the like. Users who moved forward with these updates could do things like increase or decrease tendencies towards certain states, remove undesirable desires, and download or delete interests. Naturally, these software updates were again met with reluctancy by many. Jack, along with plenty of others like him, avoided any updates that altered more than just the existing functionality for as long as they could. Jack felt strongly that the alterations of tendencies or desires or interests would change his entire sense of self-identity and render him unfamiliar to himself. However, as time passed and the same pattern of history unfolded, Jack, along with the majority of others like him, eventually opted in and downloaded some of these software updates. In the year 2153, Jack downloaded his first major software update known as Version Prime, an update that allowed users to control and self-regulate personal desires, habits, and interests. Upon the download, as usual, Jack had to read the terms of service and digitally sign his name where asked, on which he signed, Jack Oudis. Following the software update, through essentially no more than a push of a button, Jack could and did download and delete desires, interests, and daily routines, often relinquishing old ones to make room for the new. Across Jack's entire lifetime, prior to the neurotype brain interface, he experienced many different interests, desires, habits, and life routines, and never felt like a different person. Even if one desire or interest led to another, the transitional period of time between them always kept him feeling like him. Although more extreme, the software update seemed to feel no different. Since Jack was still always the one choosing to download or delete these features of himself, it all still felt like it was based off of his foundational desire for certain desires, interests, and routines, strung along a consistent, non-broken line of self-identity. And so, even though Jack had a nearly completely different body, new set of technical skills, new desires and interests, and new daily life, at this point, in his mind, he still felt like Jack. In the year 2157, Jack downloaded Software Update Version Senior, a brand new revolutionary update that allowed users to have memories added or removed from the memory storage part of their mind. Initially, this was intended to be used towards removing past memories of trauma, but it eventually evolved into more general memory removal as well as positive memory implantation. Users could now plant false memories inside their long-term memory bank, altering how they remembered the quality of their life. Jack slowly but surely participated in this, deleting traumatic memories about his former biological childhood self, as well as implanting nice memories throughout his teens and 20s to counterbalance the period of prolonged depression he actually lived through. These alterations were integrated subtly into the mind over time so that it felt like the original memories simply faded away and the new ones weren't even new. Almost like how the biological mind might block out or repaint bad memories through repression or nostalgia. At this point, Jack forgot, altered, and had false memories, different interests, desires, skills, opinions, and routines, and an almost completely different body. And yet, even across all of this, he continued to feel like Jack. It was as if as long as he still had a continuous memory of himself, he sustained a continuous tracking of himself and thus a consistent sense of self-identity, regardless of any change or accurate awareness of that change. He recognized that he was not the same person in any way, and perhaps couldn't even know what that same person really was anymore. But yet, somewhere in him, something still felt like him. As part of the continual development and improvement of the technology, Jack filled out optional questionnaires about every month or so. At the top of each questionnaire form, it asked, "Please confirm your identity. Who are you?"